15 of the fantasy football season, and here's a few running backs I would start here for week one of the fantasy playoffs here in week 15. The first guy, Antonio Gibson of the Washington football team. So Gibson, he's been pretty solid this season, even though he's been dealing with a season-long shin injury. But hey, he's a tough guy. He's been playing through it, and he's been contributing for the most part this year. Week 12 versus Seattle, 29 carries, 111 yards, 7 catches, 35 yards, a 2-point conversion. Week 13 of Vegas, 23 carries, 88 yards, 5 catches, 23 yards, a touchdown. And then last week in a tough matchup with bad game script versus the Dallas Cowboys, 10 carries, 36 yards, 2 catches, 5 yards, and a fumble loss. But this week here at Philly, it's going to be a tight ball game between these NFC East rivals. And the Eagles do give up the 10th most fantasy points to running backs on the season. So I think this week here, Gibson, he bounces back with a good game. And it wouldn't surprise me to see him go for 100 yards total and a touchdown in this one. So I would start him this week. The second guy is Clyde Edwards-Helaire of the Kansas City Chiefs. So Edwards-Helaire, he's come back over the last few weeks here from his injuries, and he's played pretty good football, probably the best of his short career so far, the first 2 years in the NFL for CEH. So the last 3 games back here, week 11 versus Dallas, 12 carries, 63 yards, a touchdown, 2 catches, 13 yards. Week 13 versus Denver, 14 carries, 54 yards, 3 catches, 28 yards. And then week 14 versus Vegas, he only had 10 carries in that one, but 37 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 3 catches for 5 yards. So week 15 here, another division matchup in the AFC West at the Los Angeles Chargers. I give up the 5th most fantasy points to running backs on the season. So I think here, Clyde Edwards-Helaire could have another good game this week. Solid number 2 running back option to start for your team. And I think he could get anywhere from at least 15 to 18 fantasy points. And I would start him with confidence as a number 2 running back this week. The next running back is Diontae Foreman of the Tennessee Titans. So it looks like he's the man over there for the next few weeks at least, until Derrick Henry comes back from his foot injury. So the last few games here for Foreman, week 10 versus New Orleans, 11 carries, 30 yards, 2 catches for 48 yards. Week 11 versus Houston, 7 carries, 25 yards, a catch for 15. Week 12 at the Pats, in a tough matchup, he went for 19 carries, 109 yards, a catch for 3 yards, and a fumble loss. And then week 14 versus Jacksonville, 13 carries, 47 yards, a touchdown, 2 catches for 15 yards. So right here in week 15, he's got a great matchup on paper. And this ball game, in my opinion, is going to be a grinded-out type of game with the Pittsburgh Steelers and the Tennessee Titans. So the Steelers give up the 9th most fantasy points to running backs on the season. And I think Foreman could have a good game. We just saw Dalvin Cook run for 200 yards. And I think Foreman could get 80 or 90 rushing yards in this one and find the end zone. So he's a running back, just like Edwards-Helaire, that I say is a solid number 2 running back option on your roster this week to start. The next guy is Eli Mitchell of the San Francisco 49ers. So Mitchell here, he was out in week 14 with a knee and a concussion, obviously. So right here, he's got a plus matchup and one of the best matchups you could have this season for fantasy football owners. Week 15, a great matchup versus the Atlanta Falcons. That give up the 7th most fantasy points to running backs on the season. So I know Mitchell this season, he's been banged up in and out of the lineup. But the games he plays, this guy puts up big numbers. Week 12 versus Minnesota, 27 carries, 133 rush yards, a touchdown, 5 catches, 35 yards. In week 13 at Seattle, 22 carries, 66 yards, a touchdown, 3 catches for 18 yards. So as long as he's playing, he's a must-start running back, in my opinion, with the great matchup versus Atlanta. And the workloads he's been getting is Eli Mitchell. And I posted last week, he didn't have a great game to have a guy to get more carries, even with Mitchell back. So right here, I like Mitchell as a start. And as long as he's healthy, you start him with confidence this week. And the 5th and final running back I would start this week, Saquon Barkley of the New York Giants. So Barkley, an injury-riddled season it's been for him, no doubt about it. But the last couple weeks, at least he's been on the field and playing now, is Barkley, and putting up serviceable numbers, at least in PPR leagues. Week 12 versus Philly, 13 carries, 40 yards, 4 catches, 13 yards. Week 13 at Miami, 11 carries, 55 yards, 6 catches, 19 yards. And week 14 at the Chargers, a good ball game, 16 carries, 64 yards, 3 catches, 31 yards, and a touchdown. So week 15 on paper, it's a tough matchup versus the Dallas Cowboys, who give up the 4th least amount of fantasy points to running backs on the season. But right here, Barkley's got a decent track record in his young career versus the Cowboys, and he's an explosive running back still. Obviously, he's not as good, in my opinion, as he was 3-4 seasons ago, but with the leg injuries and knee injuries, obviously it catches up and you lose that little burst. But I think in this ball game versus Dallas, he could go for 15 to 18 fantasy points, and he's still a guy many owners drafted early in the late first, early second round of their drafts coming into the year. And he's a running back I would start. The few running backs I would start here for Week 15 of the fantasy football season.